Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be back. I love this aquarium. It is probably, in my opinion, and I've been around a little bit, one of the best aquariums in the country. If you want to learn something about marine animals, this is where you come. So it's always a pleasure to speak here. So tonight, and it's always great to talk about sharks. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is some good news. And quite often we hear bad news all the time about what's happening in our environment, right? We hear about global climate change, and we hear about pollution, and we hear about...
Turn on the mic.
Oh, is it?
Turn on the mic, sorry. You're tall and it's...
Okay.
It's a little hard to hear in the back.
Oh, you can't hear me? I'll use my professor voice.
Yeah,
how's that? Is that better?
I turn less tall, really. I know. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, how's that? Is that better?
Yeah.
Everybody in the back? Got me?
Yeah.
Jeff Landsman, can you hear me? Okay, he's not sleeping. I know Jeff's not sleeping. Okay, that's good. Okay, so tonight I'm going to share with you what I think is some good news. And I actually had to go back and dust off some stock assessments to make sure that I was going to give you accurate information. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is bringing them back, and if I can get my clicker to work here. Yay! Okay, here we go. So California sharks. So much of what we know about California sharks is dictated by our local oceanography. And in California, we're fortunate in that we have what we call several bioregions, right? So we have places along the Southern California coast where the water is nice and warm, but up along this part of the California coastline, the cold California current brings down cooler water from Alaska. So as a result, it gives us different populations of animals. And we are right at that bio break. So where we are in Southern California, right here, is a bio break. So a lot of animals make it as far north as Point Conception and don't go much farther than that because it's too cold for them. And then some of the cooler water species kind of drop out here because it starts getting a little too warm. So as the result, we see shark populations that also structure themselves along those current regimes, right? So one of the things that we're very fortunate to have in Southern California is about 20 species of sharks that are found within nearshore waters. And when I say nearshore, I'm talking about usually waters less than about 300 feet deep. So they can be fairly close to shore out to, maybe a couple miles offshore. So we have a lot of different rays, we'll call them close cousins to our sharks. But we've got things like leopard sharks and shovel-nosed guitarfish. We've got gray and brown smoothhounds. We've got soup-fin sharks. We've got even white sharks, swell sharks, horn sharks. All these species can be found ranging from close to shore to further offshore and deeper water. So we're very fortunate to have very rich shark fauna, if you will, off our coast. And in addition, we're also in a unique place that during strong El Niños, we'll get all these southern migrants that come up and visit us in Southern California. So for example, many people may not know that actually tiger sharks have been caught off Southern California. Bull sharks have been caught off Southern California. Whale sharks have been seen off Catalina. So during strong El Niños, these species will move up from Baja waters and will actually come to Southern California. And we always tell people, listen, we're talking about having a strong El Nino this coming summer. Who knows what can show up? But I always remind fishermen that if you ever catch a weird shark that you haven't seen before, chances are it could be one of those El Nino migrants moving up. So let's talk a little bit about historic threats to sharks in California. So remember, in Southern California, we have a very big population. Our economy and our industries have changed over time, and we've developed a lot. So the first thing that we know has been a major threat to sharks in California has been fishing. And it's a really interesting phenomenon because a lot of California's early economy was based on fishing. In addition, we have issues with pollution. When you have 22 million people all living fairly close to the coastline and you have a lot of industry, you're going to have issues with pollution. So these are other things that we've struggled with that also impact shark populations. We have habitat loss. A lot of Southern California used to be a lot of wetland, and we've filled a lot of that in, which means we've lost a lot of wetland habitat that many shark species may use as nursery habitat. And then, of course, we have issues with disease. Now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about shark disease and the challenges of dealing with that and understanding if diseases are spreading. But more importantly, and this is the one that's a bit more insidious, is climate change. And a lot of shark researchers right now are paying a lot of attention, because how will climate change affect populations? For some populations right now, they actually may be benefiting from our current climate situation. We know it's not going to stay that way. It's going to change. And what we don't know is how that will affect many shark populations. So if we go back to what we think is the major threat that shark populations have faced in California, the number one thing, and this has been found to be global, has been fishing impacts. And remember, fishing takes on a variety of different impacts, right? So one impact is direct fishing for that shark species for its consumption or use. The other is sometimes you're trying to catch something else and you accidentally catch sharks. They're not the target, but they're still of value and you can still sell them. But they're not the target of that fishery. And then the third thing is sometimes you catch them, you don't want them, and there's no market for them, so you just discard them. So keep in mind, fishing impacts can include everything under that umbrella. So let's talk about California's early fishing history. So for those of you that have lived in San Pedro for a long time, you know this was a fishing town. And much like the towns that I came from on the East Coast, that entire town for 100 years or more had been dedicated to commercial fishing. So keep in mind, in the early days, this is what San Pedro looked like. It had a lot of boats, and some of those boats were fishing tuna. So imagine going out to Catalina Channel and catching tuna back in those days. We had canneries here. We had a major industry that was focused on that. So throughout California's history, in Southern California in particular, we've seen a lot of these fisheries kind of come and go. And that is something that has had an important negative impact on sharks, and believe it or not, an important positive impact on sharks. So we've had a variety of different fisheries, ranging from purse seining, which is targeting things like sardine, anchovies, squid, and tuna. And purse seine is basically a big net that you can set around an entire school and purse it up, and then you can take things out of that net. And usually it's schooling species. And quite often when fishers are out targeting these things, there are often sharks associated with those species because they're trying to eat those things, and sharks would be caught in these purse seines as well. We have things like long lining, trawling, gill netting. All these fisheries have existed in Southern California, and many of them have come and some of them have gone. In addition, our most heavily intensive overfishing period ranged from about 1920 till about the 1990s. So it started back in the 20s. And I'm going to give you some examples of overfishing of sharks that happened as early as the 30s. In addition, very few of these fisheries actually targeted sharks. They were usually targeting something else. Sharks were caught as bycatch in those fisheries, and if they were of value, they were landed, and if not of value, they were just discarded. Okay, in addition, we have recreational fisheries, and recreational fisheries may also target sharks. Historically, their impacts on those populations have been less than those of commercial fisheries, which we're actually working on a greater scale. However, we are starting to see growing impacts of recreational fishing on many fish populations, not just sharks, but other fishes as well. So what we're seeing is a growing recreational fishing community, and some of those fishers are actually doing things that in some cases may be as destructive as commercial fishing. So a lot of times recreational fishers say, oh, it's just me and I'm only taking my 2. But you have to multiply that by 1,000,000. And when you do that, suddenly you begin to see that those impacts can be greater than people might imagine. In addition, because of technology, recreational fishing technology has gotten much better. So now, instead of having this big, thick line on this big reel to go catch something big, we now have things like braided dacron and spectra line that can be very, very thin and incredibly tough, and you can land very big animals with that. In addition, you can have hooks like that size that you're out fishing off a beach or a pier. So imagine what you'd be fishing for off a beach or a pier with a hook that size and a reel that looks like you're trying to land a marlin. So again, this technology has changed, and it's allowed fishers to catch bigger things, and those bigger things are coming back, which enables them to fish for these things even off public beaches and piers. So unfortunately, many of those fishers are doing catch and release, and we don't understand the impacts of that catch and release practice. So when a shark is caught and it's brought up on shore, or it's hoisted up by a grappling hook up a pier, and then they say, well, it's a white shark, it's protected, I gotta throw it back. We don't know whether that shark that's basically torn up by that hook is actually gonna survive. So even though these practices are occurring and these people are just catch and release, which you can legally do with a white shark, you're just not allowed to keep it, we don't know whether that shark would survive that impact. So keep in mind, all these things are occurring and have been occurring, and regulations have tightened up on some of them, and for others, there still really are no regulations for. Now let's talk a little bit about disease. Now disease is an interesting thing because disease in other fishes we can more readily see because when those fishes are sick, because of their swim bladders in their body, when they die, they float, which means researchers can get access to them, can do necropsies on them, can study them and figure out what caused their death, like a forensic scientist, right? But with sharks, when sharks are sick or when they die, they sink, which means quite often they may have a disease that we don't know about because we never get access to those animals. So quite often what we've been seeing, or what we've been seeing more recently, are sharks what we call stranding. They'll wash up on a shoreline, they'll be on a beach. Sometimes they're moribund. That means they're very sick, they're so sick, they're disoriented, they'll swim to the beach and they won't be able to swim off. So they strand, much like marine mammals. So when we get access to those animals, now we have the ability to use those forensic tools to understand what diseases these animals may be carrying, and are those diseases spreading. So for example, these stranded animals, we have seen an increase in strandings of sharks in particular over the last 20 years. So I've teamed up with Dr. Mark Okihiro, who's the state fish pathologist. The guy is absolutely amazing. He spends 12 hours doing a necropsy on a shark. My students love to do that with him because they learn a lot about shark anatomy, but they also learn a lot about the types of diseases that he's able to discern that these animals may have. So for example, some of you might have heard about these massive leopard shark die-offs that have occurred in San Francisco Bay over the last few years. In some cases, 1,000 individuals have died in a single season. And it was Dr. Okihiro's hard work that figured out eventually that it was a fungal infection that was actually getting into the brain of these sharks. So sharks have a hole in the top of their head known as an endolymphatic duct, and it provides a portal to the inner ear, which is then connected to the brain. So when these animals experience these pathogens in the water, they can become infected with these things, and they spread. So there's been a lot of research focusing on where that fungus is coming from and why it might bloom in certain conditions, causing these mass die-offs to these sharks. In addition, in salmon sharks, mako sharks, threshers, and white sharks, which are all what we call endothermic sharks, these sharks have internalized red muscle, and as long as they are swimming, they can generate heat and retain that heat. In other words, they can keep their bodies warmer than the water that they move through, which is a huge advantage to them over their prey. What's really interesting is we've noticed all these species form these stranding events, and when Dr. Okihiro has done necropsies on them, we found massive brain infections, but they're not actually from a fungal infection, they're from a bacteria. And the bacteria that's been isolated is known as a carnobacteria. Now, carnobacteria is used in the meatpacking industry as a preservative. But one of my graduate students identified 5 strains of carnobacteria found in these stranded sharks that are pathogenic. In other words, they will cause tissue disease or necrosis. And they're only found in sharks. So basically what happens with these animals, and you'll quite often during the summer we'll see these salmon sharks, newborn salmon sharks will wash up on the beach. And they will have their brains riddled with this bacterial infection. And it actually begins to eat away at the brain. And what happens is we think they become disoriented, swim to the beach, and at that point they're going to die. There is no cure at that point. Their brains have become so badly degraded that they will not survive that. Now what's been interesting is we've seen this increase, not just in salmon sharks, which were the original species it was identified in, but we're now starting to see it in these other species, thresher sharks, mako sharks, and even white sharks. So now our concern is, are these bacteria spreading? Did they come from a commercial strain and have become modified, and now potentially you could be causing a disease that's passing in sharks? So we need to look out for these things. We need students that are trained to detect these things, because recognizing disease outbreaks early means we might have an opportunity to prevent them from spreading. So now I want to talk about a few key species in California that have been impacted by commercial fishing and what we now know about their populations. So this is an example I always use in my fisheries ecology class, soupfin sharks. Some people call them taupe. Those of us that have lived in California for a long time know them as soupfin sharks. Okay, so soupfin sharks actually were the first targeted shark fishery in California. So in the early days, they were targeted primarily for their livers because their livers contained high concentrations of vitamin A. So prior to World War I, or just after World War I, we did not have a synthetic source of vitamin A. So shark liver oil was the primary source for vitamin A. So as a result, a soupfin shark fishery started in California. These are the fishing records. These are in metric tons or metric pounds. And here you can see in 1937 that fishery started and it literally exploded. And then within a 5-year period, it crashed in 5 years of intensive fishing. So by that point, they weren't able to catch soupfin anymore. By the early 1940s, they were gone, and we were able to synthesize vitamin A, which gladly took pressure off many shark populations, because once they were done with soupfin, they would have moved on to other species that also had vitamin A in their livers. But this is a great example of a fishery, a shark fishery, that got rapidly overfished. In fact, it's the classic example of a boom and bust fishery in California. So, good news is, it's only taken about 100 years for them to come back, but we are seeing signs of recovery. So this was an independent gillnet study done by Dan Pondella and Larry Allen that were looking for white sea bass, and also noticed over these years that there was an increase in the catch per unit effort. That means the more nets they fished, the more sharks they caught. So the harder they fished, the more sharks they caught. That's a good sign. That means there's more out there. So this upward trend means that soupfin sharks are coming back. Now, those of you that snorkel, spearfish, or dive have probably been fortunate enough in the last 5 or 6 years to see soupfins swimming around right off Palos Verdes. So I've spent almost 40 years in Southern California, and it only has been recently, I'd say in the last 10 or 15 years, that I've actually seen soupfin in the wild. So this is a positive sign. Now remember, only 100 years for recovery? Not bad. We can do better. Okay, so they are highly migratory. So we've done some tagging with a colleague at Scripps, and we found these sharks will migrate all the way up to Washington State and turn around and migrate all the way back. So what's really interesting about them, and the reason why it's taken 100 years to come back, is they're very slow growing, and they only reproduce every 3 years. So they have a very low reproductive rate, which probably explains that slow growth. So they're now recreationally caught. Fishermen are now, because they're becoming more abundant, they're catching them off piers, and people do eat them. So the fishery seems to be not just isolated to commercial. They're incidentally caught in gill nets still offshore. But by and large, all these sharks that were caught prior to in that 30s were all caught very close to shore. Okay, so now let's talk about maker sharks. This is another really interesting species that's primarily a pelagic shark, which means it's typically offshore. And they were predominantly caught in the offshore drift gillnet fishery that originally started for sharks in California and then kind of morphed into fishing for swordfish as sharks kind of started to go away. So in our fishery in Southern California, the makos that were caught primarily in our drift gillnet fishery were juveniles. Most of them were juveniles. And that put a big impact on the population. I'll show you what those numbers look like in a minute. So here you can see these are total catches. This is going back to the 80s. These are landings in metric tons. The blue is US, and these are different US fisheries. And then we have also Mexico, and then we have Mexico, we have Japan. So this is the entire North Pacific stock. So the thing I want you to pay attention to in these years right here in the 80s, this was really the peak in gillnet fishing. Gillnet fishing started in earnest in the 40s, and the gillnets originally were made out of cotton, which means when you put them in the water, they're visible. So a gill net is called a gill net because fish swim into it and they get caught around the gills. It's an entangled net. So the original gill nets that started in the 40s that were made out of cotton weren't very effective. They worked really good in murky waters because the fish couldn't see the net well. Anybody know what happened in the 70s? Advent of plastic, and then we moved to monofilament. And monofilament, when you put it in the water, becomes invisible. So now you have an invisible net in the water that fish swim into and get entangled. So that fishery exploded because gill nets, especially the monofilament ones, were extremely cheap, were very light because you could put them on a small boat, and you could set them literally from the shoreline offshore. So these became very prominent fisheries. So in the 80s, that fishery exploded. Everybody with even a 28-foot boat were buying gill nets and going out and gill net fishing. So the number of boats with permits back in the peak in the mid-80s was almost 2,000 boats in Southern California alone had permits for gill netting. So it rapidly grew into a big fishery. And then we see by the mid to early 90s, that fishery dropped down dramatically. So part of that was due to overfishing of mako sharks. And you're going to see the same trend with thresher sharks, the other species caught, and leopard sharks, and even soupfin were caught in this fishery. So this fishery had a big impact. And then what happened is the target species started to go down. It was no longer profitable, and a lot of people got out of the business. So a lot of the boats gave up their permits. So that took a lot of pressure off. And in addition, many of the shark fisheries were then heavily regulated because fishery managers recognized that they were taking them either immature individuals, not allowing them an opportunity to breed, or they were taking pregnant females, in the case of thresher sharks, which then caused the population to decline very rapidly. So there was minimal recreational fishing for mako sharks. Here you can see in the US, and a lot of people think, the US had a big impact on mako sharks throughout the whole North Pacific, but you can see really it's the Taiwanese and Japanese fleet that has a big impact. And even Mexico has a relatively small impact, but in more recent years, the US impact has gone down, Mexican impact has kind of gone up a bit. Now, the bottom line is with mako sharks, and the reason why you see all this data and the reason why NOAA manages this as a North Pacific stock is because these things move a lot. So these are tagging data, satellite tagging data of mako sharks. These are small males, small females, large males, large females. And one of the things you may notice is large mako sharks move just like white sharks. They exhibit almost the exact same oceanic migratory patterns. They use the coastline, especially during breeding and pupping season. So many of the juveniles are found fairly close to shore. And that made them particularly susceptible to those commercial fisheries. But their high movements also offer them a lot of protection. So now as many of those fisheries are declining, now what we start to see is many of these populations coming back. So we are now seeing more mako sharks. NOAA's stock assessment for makos is very positive right now. The population seems to be doing quite well. So signs of population recovery, yay. Okay, now thresher sharks were also caught in this fishery, and it was originally targeting a lot of adult threshers. These are common thresher sharks. Unfortunately, it's hard to get a good picture of a common thresher because they live in kind of murky water. So this is actually a pelagic thresher. The nearshore set net fisheries that would literally set from the shoreline out offshore were catching predominantly juveniles. So the offshore drift net fishery was targeting adults. Nearshore drift or set net fishery were targeting juveniles. So we see the same sort of pattern that we saw with makos, right? So here we have US fisheries were dominating in the early 80s. That fishery exploded, the gillnet fishery exploded. And then we see by the 90s, it was already in decline. A lot of boats getting out of the business. And then a lot of gillnet fishery regulations started to go in place in the late 80s because they saw declines. And as a result, they set seasons, depth limits, and fishing limits in terms of where and when they could fish. So those fishing regulations have allowed the population to start to recover. So the most recent stock assessment for the Northeast Pacific, so that includes Mexico, US, that population is also showing very promising signs of recovery. Now, we know that also because a lot of recreational fishers are now catching more and more threshers, and in fact, they're catching them off local piers. This is Huntington Beach Pier, this was last year. They caught 6 or so, kind of large juveniles, they're not quite mature, in a morning's worth of fishing, right? So while everybody may go, oh, it's a bummer to see sharks being caught and killed, the point is that the population's coming back, so people have access to them more. So they are recovering. Or not, there was a commercial fishery for leopard sharks. People still catch them and eat them. They were being caught quite often in that nearshore set gillnet fishery that was targeting halibut and white sea bass. And you can see here from the NOAA data, or the Cal Fish and Game data, that the peak in leopard shark landings was in the early 80s. Again, when did that fishery take off? Gillnet fisheries spiked in the mid-'80s, and then we see those numbers drop, and that's because they were having an impact on leopard shark populations. So now what happens is we see that gillnet fishing has been reduced. In fact, it no longer exists in state waters. So therefore, most of the leopard shark activity is close to shore, and that isolates them from the existing gillnet fishery, which is still fishing outside 3 miles. Recreational fishing has been kind of constant, but it seems to be increasing for leopard sharks. There's been slightly higher catch. And there's good data from independent fishing studies showing that leopard shark populations since the banning of nearshore gillnets has been steadily increasing. So these are all positive signs that despite the fact that many of these animals are still being caught in commercial fisheries or recreational fisheries, that their populations are still coming up. Okay, now I'm going to talk about white sharks, my favorite. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on these because we spent a lot of time and money working on these. So white sharks were actually probably pretty significantly impacted by the nearshore gillnet fishery. So that same fishery that was targeting halibut and white sea bass, setting very close to shore, we're actually catching a lot of juvenile white sharks in those nets. Occasionally adults would be targeted, but not very often. And there was actually a situation where a fisherman went out and killed 6 adult white sharks at the Farallones. And that initiated legislation to protect white sharks in California in 1994. So it's been fairly rare for adult white sharks to be caught in any commercial fisheries. And I'll show you some of those data in a minute. There's higher commercial bycatch of white sharks in Mexico, and they use the same gill nets that we use. So their fishery actually has greater impacts than ours does, but their gillnet fisheries are larger and more diverse than ours. And then, of course, white sharks were protected in state waters, in California waters, in 1994, and they were protected throughout the rest of U.S. waters in 2005. So that extends out to 200 miles. So it is technically illegal to target, land, and sell white sharks, to keep them. Nonetheless, when they were caught prior to 1994, they showed up in fish markets. These are mako shark steaks. I could put a white shark steak right next to that, and unless you could see the color of the skin, you would not know the difference. I could cook them for you, I could serve them to you, and you wouldn't know the difference between white shark, mako shark, and thresher shark. They all taste the same, delicious. So the bottom line is prior to 1994, they were being sold in fish markets, and if you ate fish tacos in Southern California, chances are you ate white shark and you didn't know it. Yes, I know. Okay, so we did a study, my students and I did a study a bunch of years ago where we wanted to look at the impact of commercial fishing on white sharks in particular. So we combed through all the fishing records we could find. The gillnet logbooks, Department of Fish and Game had a shark tagging program, warden reports, observer programs. PACFIN is basically one of the fishing records that keep track of what gets landed. And then we were working with Monterey Bay Aquarium, who were working directly with commercial fishers to see what was being caught in terms of those sharks in scientific collections, newspapers, scientific articles, anything we could find that had a record of a white shark being caught in any fishery in California. So in these records, we found some really interesting trends. So the records date back from 1936 to 2009. And what we found, we were able to get size information for some of the records. And what you'll notice here, we have entangled nets, those are gill nets, set line, those are long line, harpoon, trawl, purse seine, lobster traps, hook and line, gaff, and no data. So you'll notice that over 84% of all the records we found came from the gillnet fishery. So they were the ones that were interacting with the white shark population the most based on those historic fishing records. And then for sizes, not surprisingly, a majority of the sharks that are being caught in that fishery are what we call yoys. That stands for young of the year, sharks less than 1 year old. And then of course there were some juveniles between about 1.5 meters to about 3.5 meters, almost 10 feet long, and then subadults and adults. So very few adults were being caught in these fisheries because the gear can't really stop them. So not surprisingly, a majority of the sharks that were being caught were juveniles. And we have no doubt that this had some impact on the white shark population, probably for a couple decades. In addition, if we look at the gillnet fisheries that had the greatest impact, so here we have the amount of nets being set per year. This is the offshore drift gillnet fishery that's targeting sharks, and it's targeting swordfish. And again, see the peak occurs in the mid-'80s in terms of the number of nets set. This is the inshore drift and set net fishery that's targeting halibut, angel sharks, and white sea bass. And again, we see their nets peak at about 17,000 nets set per year in the mid-'80s. And then we see this decline. So the decline in the number of nets being set is largely attributed to all these target species actually declining and boats no longer able to make a profit and getting out of the business. And in addition, biologists seeing those declines and managers setting new limits to those fisheries, limiting the seasons they can fish, the depths they can fish, and the size of the mesh they can fish to try to regulate this decrease. Now the bars that you see here indicated the number of sharks being reported caught during those years by their size class. So you'll notice that as the fishery grows, the number of juvenile white sharks being caught in that fishery begins to go up. And then as the fishery declines, the numbers go down. Now a really interesting thing, two really interesting things happened in 1994. As I mentioned before, in 1994, the state of California passed legislation to protect white sharks from fishing. Despite the fact that they would occasionally nibble on people, the state had the wherewithal to do that because we understood their vulnerability to being overfished. So white sharks were protected in 1994. But the more important thing that we did is if you understand how fisheries management is done in California, it's done by the Fish and Game Commission. They're political appointees who work with Fish and Game to decide how much can be caught, how it can be caught, and whether there's season limits, bag limits, those sorts of things. But something really interesting also happened in 1994. The gillnet fishery was under a lot of scrutiny because they were catching a lot of marine mammals, birds, and non-targeted species in the inside set gillnet fishery. And it was actually brought to voters on a referendum to vote on. That was Prop 132. So in California history, you almost never see fisheries management issues being brought to voters, but this one was. So in 1994, California voters voted to ban the use of gillnets in state waters from the shoreline out to 3 miles. And look what happens after that. Gillnet fishing is relatively stable, still existing off California. But after that, we see the number of juvenile white sharks being reported caught in that fishery go up. So as a biologist, I look at that and go, well, if there's more babies, that's a good sign. So that is a sign of positive population growth. Okay, I would argue that white shark population recovery isn't just a result of protection. It's not just us protecting them from gill netting. They have to have sufficient food. So when we started to look at what white sharks eat and whether there's sufficient food around, that's when we start to see some really interesting trends. And I'm going to talk about marine mammals. I'm going to talk specifically about pinnipeds here, seals and sea lions. Now, by the early 1900s, pretty much all our marine mammals had been hunted to the verge of extinction. By the early 1900s, it was estimated that there were maybe 16 northern elephant seals left on the planet. Maybe as few as 3,000 California sea lions left. So they had been hunted for their oil. Sea lions were just shot because they were viewed as competitors for fisheries. And then what we see in 1973, Marine Mammal Protection Act goes into place. And then we see pretty much all these seal populations show this dramatic sort of recovery. So what do adult white sharks like to eat? Well, this is one of their favorites. You cannot have this population growth from protection alone if there's insufficient food resources. So I would argue that recovery of marine mammals has helped bring white sharks back. I'm going to use California sea lion as probably one of the best examples, and those of you that fish go, oh, California sea lions, not my favorite, but we've seen truly remarkable population recovery from them. So these are NOAA data based on beach counts. So you got to remember that by 1930, some of the estimates may have been as low as 3,000, right? That's all of California and Baja. And then of course, Marine Mammal Protection Act goes in place in 1973. Look at this population increase. Look what happens when you stop killing them, right? Okay, then we have a strong El Nino, and we know El Ninos really impact our sea lion populations. They still, to this day, impact our sea lion populations. And then, of course, we have major gillnet regulations go in place in the mid-1990s, right? Look at the population at this point. So by the mid-1990s, remember, this is the time when people are being told that our commercial fisheries, our local fisheries have been completely overfished. California sea lion is one of the most voracious carnivores we have in our coastal waters. So if our waters are overfished, how is this population growing at a rate of 6.5% per year? And then by 2012, NOAA concluded that the California sea lion population had reached its carrying capacity at somewhere between 270 and 470,000 animals. So in less than 100 years, This particular pinniped went on the from the verge of extinction to fully recovered. Maybe more sea lions on the planet now than ever before. Now, if you're a white shark, you would say, yay. Okay, so conservation success for white sharks, yay, but not everybody cheers. So we're going to talk about that. So what we have noticed, and we work with all the ocean lifeguards in California, is that they have seen a 5-fold increase over the last 10 years of white sharks being spotted fairly close to shore in Southern California. They have good records of this. In addition, you have to remember we have one of the most heavily populated coastlines in the world. There are 20 million people that live between Santa Barbara and San Diego within 60 miles of the coast. We are unique in that we have one of those coastlines that we have access to the ocean for recreation year-round. In the US, that's a big deal, right? So considering the size of our population, people are out enjoying the ocean for recreation year-round. Okay, so more sharks, more people. And of course, this is Hermosa Beach on a good day, 10 to 15,000 people are in the water any given day in Santa Monica Bay. And one of the things that we've noticed, especially about 8 or 10 years ago when white sharks started popping up at beaches, is you say the word white shark off a beach, and the response was, oh my God, get people out of the water. So beach closures significantly increased over the last 10 years, corresponding with this increase in sightings. Okay, now, more sharks in the water, more people in the water, ipso facto, you'd expect more bites. We're not seeing that. In fact, the bite rate has actually decreased per capita. That was kind of a shocker, right? So our bite rate, nonetheless, when bites occur, and they still occur, and we do occasionally have fatalities because a little bite from a big shark like a white shark can do a lot of damage. So as a result, when that happens, it gets a lot of press. So if that press occurs in the spring during North America beach season, that news cycle can last for quite a while. And it can have economic impacts on our local community. And right now, I'm working with an environmental economist to calculate what those are. If they occur in the winter or the fall, their impacts are less because it gets less media attention. Nonetheless, with all this increased white shark activity off public beaches, lifeguards were coming to us saying, what do we do? Is it safe for people to be in the water? And 15 years ago, we said, we don't know. We know nothing about these animals. So in 2018, we co-authored a bill with Assembly member Patrick O'Donnell, who helped us get funding from the state of California to expand our Monterey Bay Aquarium funded research to form the California Beach Safety Program. So that started in 2018, and that program is really focused on public safety aspects of the population increase of white sharks. So we have a bunch of research goals as part of this program. Where are the white sharks along the coast? When are they near shore? What are they doing while they're near shore? How long are they going to stay? When are they near people? Do they pose a significant risk to people? These are our research questions that directly relate to public safety. And these are the things that lifeguards and the public want to know. What do we do with this information? Well, we have a lot of people that need it. We train lifeguards on how to identify sharks and how to identify behavior. We have education programs for fishers on how to avoid catching white sharks. We have junior lifeguard programs and a K through 12 program that if I get a little bit of time left, I'll talk a little bit about. And then of course we have public outreach. So we know that seasonality of sharks along our coast varies. Juveniles are typically along our coast in the spring. We have these hot spots that pop up. In addition, we have the offshore islands where typically our adults are, typically around the offshore islands in the central California coast. So we have the nursery in Southern California. Mainly what we get along our beaches are juveniles. So one of the projects one of my grad students, Patrick Rex, has done is he's flown drone surveys along around 26 beaches across Southern California over a 2-year period, and using the drones to calculate how many people are in the water, what are they doing, and then where are they in proximity to the shoreline, the wave break, and how close are they to sharks. So using that data, he's been able to fly these missions, and these drones are a very powerful science tool. They have a highly accurate GPS. We know the altitude, we know the speed. We can correlate all the people and sharks that we see with these environmental variables so that we can make predictions on where we see them. We've worked with engineers to develop machine learning algorithms to help us measure these things. And what Patrick found was at aggregation sites that he surveyed, places where aggregations of juvenile white sharks were, 97% of those days, white sharks were seen near people, multiple times. In fact, we know, probably yesterday or today, probably a dozen people had a white shark swim right underneath them and they didn't know it at those aggregation sites. This is happening every single day, multiple times per day at these aggregation sites. And this is changing the way we look at how white sharks interact around people. So we just published a paper, it got a lot of press, you probably heard something about it. We use a lot of different technology to follow these animals around and see where they're going so that we can help answer some of those questions. So we use satellite tags, acoustic transmitters, even smart tags like Fitbits that we've built for sharks. So we can address different aspects of what they're doing when they're at these beaches. Here's our big acoustic receiver array that's constantly listening for sharks with acoustic tags. These are all about 100 yards off the beach. And a team of divers has to go out and pick these up. It takes us about a month to download all the receivers throughout Southern California. So what we've noticed is that there are these aggregation sites that vary from time to time. They pop up at a site. The sharks will be there maybe for a couple years, and then that site will go cold and they'll shift somewhere else. So right now we have a big aggregation up off Carpinteria and another big one down off Torrey Pines. So to help lifeguards get more real-time data, we've developed these specialized buoys. So instead of a diver having to pick it up, now when a shark swims by one of these buoys, the lifeguards get a text alert, and then they can click on that, and it takes them to a web page, and then it shows them the buoys where the detections are. And think of these like baseball cards for the sharks. So they can look and see what shark was detected. Some of the tags have temperature sensors and depth sensors. They tell them how deep and the warmth of the water the shark's in. And then they can click on one of those and it gives them the stats. So where was that shark tagged? How big was it? Was it male or female? And they can actually run a visualization that will show them all the locations where that shark was detected. So the lifeguards use this technology like a scientist. They're using it to understand patterns of behavior. And they ask, if a shark's detected off my beach every single day, but nobody's seeing it, it's not bothering anybody, should I pull people out of the water? Every time they close a beach, it costs that community money. So by using this tool, they're managing beaches better and safer. So we have a lot of explanations as to why the sharks are using shallow water. It's warm, it's safe. Believe it or not, those babies get born and they're on their own. There's no parental care. So they look for these shallow habitats, we think, because it's safe for them. And if they're going to spend weeks to months there, like we know that they do, they have to eat, and there's lots of food there as well. So we use all these combinations of technologies to try to figure out why sharks pick this beach, but not this one and this one. So we can tag a bunch of sharks, we can have a bunch of receivers, we can track their movements of a bunch of individuals using those acoustic receivers. We can fly drones over top so we can count how many sharks are there. We can estimate their size. We can see how often they're next to people. And then we have this autonomous underwater vehicle, looks like a little torpedo, that can go out, swim back and forth along this beach, and map all the environmental conditions in 3D, high resolution. So we can ask, why is the shark at this beach and not at this one or this one? Is it because the water's warmer? Is it because it's clear? Is it because there's more chlorophyll or more prey? So we can use all these technologies to try to answer those questions. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data from one of my graduate students, Emily Spurgeon, who tagged a bunch of juvenile white sharks up off Carpinteria. So these are all our acoustic receivers, and we had tagged, I think, 31 sharks. This was data for 2001. What you're seeing is an animation of juvenile white sharks. This is about a 2.5 mile stretch of beach. And then the color you see here is seafloor temperature. So you can see how dynamic this nearshore environment is in terms of changes in water temperatures. This is degrees C. So once, this is probably about 52 degrees. So water temperature can be as low as 52 degrees in the bottom and can be as warm at the surface as almost 62 or 63 degrees. So there's strong thermoclines at this beach. There's a rocky reef here, there's a rocky reef here, and you'll notice these rocky reefs warm up over the course of the day. So we've seen these sharks actually aggregate in this area and then using different parts of the beach, moving back and forth along the beach at different times of day. So by using this technology, Emily's been able to answer questions about how sharks select temperature. They have a thermal envelope, so we call it the 3 bears hypothesis. So juvenile white sharks don't like water too cold, and they don't like it too warm, and they seek out these cells of water that enable them to grow the fastest. So the next question is, if they're going to spend all their time there, what are they eating? So I have 3 graduate students working on this. So you know the old saying, you are what you eat, right? So here's a baby white shark swimming along. These are all stingrays. All those dots you see are stingrays. And that is what we thought a favorite food. So one of my graduate students, Jamila Samara Chacon, would go out and take muscle biopsies from these sharks, a little muscle biopsy. And then we would do beach stains in these areas and take muscle biopsies of all the things we thought they were eating. And we also got some sharks from fishermen offshore, which Chuck Winkler helped with us, and we could take muscle biopsies and blood from those sharks. And what we found was very interesting. The sharks that were caught by the fishermen offshore actually were eating different things than the sharks that used the aggregations. And the sharks that we tagged offshore never joined the aggregations. So it turns out, based on diet, we may actually have 2 subpopulations of white sharks. Loners that hang out offshore, and then, I guess, groups that like to aggregate, and they don't like to be right next to each other near shore. So why would there be 2 subpopulations of juvenile white sharks? Next question. Okay, so then one of the other grad students is asking, why are they at this aggregation site? So she's doing beach stains to count all the different types of things that we think they might eat. We use what are called BRUVs. These are remote underwater video cameras that we can stick in the water, and we can get selfies of fish. We can count how many species that may be in that area. So she can figure out how much food is at an aggregation site, and we can compare that to non-aggregation sites. So are they here for the grinds? Are they here for the food? Or are they here for the warm water? Or are they here because that's where their buddies are hanging out? So we can begin to answer those questions. And then my other grad student, Zach Merson, is actually taking water samples, and we can filter that water for DNA, sloughed off DNA from white sharks and their prey. So we're doing the same thing. We could ask how much prey and what species are found at an aggregation site and at a non-aggregation site, and are they here because a specific type of prey is there? So just by filtering water, we can get DNA. So now we got to get this information out to the public. So one of the tools we use are called shark checks. These are public information. We were just here, right, the last 2 days. So I have an army of undergraduates, and I have an education director that's trained them. We go to public beaches. We march up and down the coastline. They get a lot of miles on the freeway. And we educate the public about beach safety. So we talk about sharks. We talk about stingrays. We talk about rip currents. We talk about all those things so that people who are using our beaches can be safe. We have a comic book series, so we have one on beach safety, one on marine pollution, and one on shark spies. These are available for free. Paper copies, we've gotten out 50,000 copies so far, and I hate the paper copies because I have to store them, but kids love them. But they're free online. So if you go to this website, if you just type in Shark Lab comic books, they'll pull them up online. You can read them on your phone. We have them in English and in Spanish. And Ken Donnell is here. My good friend and artist has pointed me towards all these wonderful student artists that did this artwork. We have our own infographics, which, thanks again, Kim, helped us find artists that helped us develop these infographics to educate people about what's happening off our beaches. You will start to see these signs and parking lots at beaches. This is one of my favorites. This is a new one that we're going to be testing. This one's going to go up off the Central California coast to educate people about shark season up there happens in the late summer, early fall when adults come back from their feeding migrations and they start to aggregate around rookeries. So this is a really cool piece of art, and our belief, and will not be intimidated because it doesn't look scary, it doesn't say warning, but they'll learn something about the waters they're going to go into and that they're sharing the waters with sharks in a non-frightening way. So we're going to actually do some sociology studies on this. We have a K through 12 program that we put together. We work with Cabrillo, we work with all the aquariums, but we also are working with a lot of schools. So Karina's put together a great curriculum. We call this Operation STEM Bait, Sharks and Robots. If you cannot get kids interested in STEM using sharks and robots, we have failed. We have ultimately failed. We have a lifeguard education program. So we train all the ocean lifeguards in Southern California and we have, by the way, some of the best lifeguards in the world in Southern California. They are the best trained, but they are not marine biologists. So if a surfer comes out of the water and says, I think I just saw a shark, they have to check that out. So we train them on how to identify various types of marine life. We train them on how to identify shark behavior to determine whether shark's acting aggressively or not. So there are partners in this research. There are partners in this education. So, good news, I would say, for California sharks. There are positive signs of population recovery, and I think a lot of that is due to improved fisheries management. However, A lot of that is because California commercial fisheries are disappearing. They're leaving. So yes, there's a positive in that, and that things are coming back. But I just want to warn you, have we outsourced our problem? We haven't stopped eating fish, right? So we've heavily regulated California fishers. But that same species can be caught in Mexican waters, driven across the border, and sold in fish markets cheaper than a California fisherman can sell it to you. And the question we should be asking is that fair? So keep in mind, people have to eat, right? We want shark populations to come back. We want to have sustainable fisheries. But we need to do it in a way that still maintains something that's important to our communities. Commercial fishing has been important to our communities, right? It's part of our culture here, especially in San Pedro. So it would be a shame to see them go away. We need to manage them properly. We need to keep them sustainable, and that could include sharks. There are great examples of well-sustained shark fisheries around the world, and we can do that here too. We have to be vigilant of disease spread. So anytime people see those dead stranded sharks on the beach, please let us know, because we run out and get them, and we're constantly keeping an eye on what's happening. We do have to be cognizant of pollution. So we are, and again, remember, sick and wounded sharks, if they're sick and wounded, they sink when they die, so we don't get to see them. It's usually ones caught by fishers that are entangled in plastic or have ingested plastic that we get to see how pervasive that is. We don't know how detrimental that is just yet. We have MPAs, we have climate change issues that we have to keep an eye on. We're seeing sharks march further north than they've been before, and a lot of that's because our waters are getting warmer. We have MPAs, and our MPAs are great for some species. They're not so effective for sharks. Why? Because our sharks move a lot. So therefore, this hodgepodge of MPAs along the Southern California coast is great for many species, but it is inadequate for sharks. So we're making good progress. We're seeing positive signs, and I think that should give us all cause for hope. But our work isn't done yet, because in my opinion, this is going to be our biggest problem in the future, and we're going to have to do a lot more work on that. So thank you. Any questions? Nope.
What about that DDT off Palos Verdes and Catalina? Has that affected the sharks?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In fact, we just got a grant from Sea Grant to look at that. Because for many of the species, like white croaker, some of the species that people eat, and you guys probably talk a lot about that on your pier, those species have been well studied and have been monitored for quite some time. But because the thought was not a lot of people eat sharks or rays, very few sharks and rays have actually been studied for DDT. So our grant is to look at that, because now we have more subsistence fishers that are eating bat rays, they're eating leopard sharks, they're eating a lot of species that they catch off the beaches and the piers. And we really don't know the level of their contaminants. I can tell you in white sharks that we have measured some of the highest levels of DDT and PCBs in baby white sharks than any other sharks. And a lot of that comes from the adults. The female has eaten a lot of marine mammals that have a lot of lipid with DDT and PCBs. They can live to be 70 years old. And those females will offload their contaminants to their babies during pregnancy. So a baby can be born with a very high contaminant load. The interesting thing is, if I were to line up a bunch of those, let's say, dead babies that we necropsy, when we looked at those sharks that had high contaminant loads, we couldn't see any sign of disease. We couldn't see any sign of tumors or anything like that in the livers that were evident. Now, it's not to say that they don't succumb to contaminants. One of the things I can tell you is the DDT levels that we measured in those sharks, if those were to occur in a sea lion, it would be dead. So sharks may actually have some very interesting ways of dealing with those contaminants that other vertebrates do not. So I have a lot of colleagues that are very interested in studying sharks and how they deal with contaminants. It's a good question.
What about this poison in the algae? I think it's Deloitte poisoning. How's that affecting both sea lions and sharks?
Man, you're asking great questions. So we don't know. So domoic acid is a little different from DDT and PCBs, right? Because those things accumulate in fat. Domoic acid gets incorporated immediately upon ingestion, right? So it doesn't get sequestered anywhere, and it gets into neural tissue, right? We have no evidence of domoic acid in sharks, mainly because nobody's looked. So right now we're teaming up with Monterey Bay Aquarium, who are now dealing with these stranded sharks, and we're going to start looking for domoic acid in them. So it's likely that they're still acquiring it because they're eating many of the same things that sea lions and seals and dolphins are eating. The question is, because they're colder bodied and their metabolisms are lower than those, we don't know if it has the same physiological impacts that it does on mammals.
I've heard different explanations for why a thresher shark has a long tail. What's your opinion?
Sure. So the best explanation is it's not a good propeller, but it works good enough that they can leap. They can jump 10 feet in the air. So they can really move when they want to. The biggest, I would say, the biggest hypothesis that we think it's used for is that's how they feed. Thresher sharks have tiny mouths and very small teeth. So what they do is they slap their prey. So there's really cool video that you can see on YouTube where researchers have trolled lures and have a camera in front of it. And what thresher sharks will do is they'll come up behind it, they'll come alongside it, and then they'll smack it. And then they'll double back. They stun it, and they'll double back and then eat it. So they use their tails as a whip. And some fishermen have learned that the hard way when they bring them on their boats. So when you bring them on the boats and their tail is thrashing all around, fishermen have actually broken their legs. They've hit their leg so hard they snap their leg. So it's a very powerful tool, not a terribly efficient propeller, but it works great for stunning your prey.
I'm from an area with lakes, and who controls the ocean?
Who controls the ocean in terms of fisheries?
The shark or the whale?
Oh, okay, good question. Yeah, so in the ocean, people always say, oh, white sharks are the king, blah, 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 or the queen, depending on, because females get bigger, so it's really white sharks are the queen. Nope, it's orca. Orca, yeah, see? Diane's like, yeah, it's orca. Yeah. 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 So orca, the only animal we know that can take down an adult white shark other than humans. And orca scare the living daylights out of me. I'll take my chances with an adult white shark any day, but orca, smart, social, yeah, they scare me. But they are truly the apex predator in the ocean.
Are whale sharks really true sharks?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so they're called whales because they're as big as a whale, but they are true sharks. In fact, they're the largest fish. The largest fish we have. They get to be about 35. Some people estimate be a little bit bigger, maybe 40 feet. They're planktivores, so like our big whales are also planktivores. So basically they're feeding on very, very tiny things and they get to be massive. So the estimates of age are probably 70 to 80 years old, maybe as old as 100. And they cover, the ones that have been satellite tagged have been shown to cover about 10,000 miles a year. So they get around. Yeah, but they're big fish, the biggest.
I had a question on the two subspecies of great whites. So since you think that there might be two different subspecies, do you think future agencies would need to individualize protection plans for these different subspecies?
Okay, so I don't want to get in trouble here. I didn't call them subspecies. No. I call them subpopulations. Right, subspecies, ooh, that's getting dangerous. Because that would mean that they're starting to evolve apart, right? To become different species. We don't think that. What we think is that behaviorally, there's a group that likes to be offshore, maybe more solitary, and then there's this other group that likes to be more social. And we see similar things in orca, right? So they're resident orca, they're transient orca, they're offshore orca. And they've developed these behaviors that have been very successful for a group. So we think that maybe that's what's happening in white sharks as the population's coming back. Maybe some of those sharks wouldn't do so well at an aggregation site because there's too much competition. So by staying offshore by yourself, if you're efficient at catching food, you're fine, right? And that would develop these two behavioral groups that do different things. So we don't know why. It's a really interesting question. And what we don't know is, does that depend on where they're born? Is there some genetic component to that drives that? We don't know. Good question. Sure.
I have a question regarding the impact of microplastics since all this material is going to the sea eventually. and gets dispersed, how is this affecting, or how does this affect the line of predator, prey? It goes from one to the other, and how does it affect, like, neurologically? It's been like put into the fat of these animals. Is there any data on it?
In sharks, no. So there's a lot of people working on that now. And there are a lot of people working on the effects of microplastics in fish. So we know that it's a growing problem. What people don't fully understand is how some of those microplastics get into certain tissues. And of course, as those plastics break down, there are chemicals that are released that are known to be carcinogenic. So we just don't, there's nothing known in sharks. I mean, right now, what most researchers are doing is looking at how much plastic is ingested. So, and that hasn't even gotten to the stage of looking at microplastics and how that could be possibly moved into tissues. So most of the work that's being done right now is being done on bony fishes. And there are a handful of people wanting to start to look at that in sharks, but we have no idea what those impacts are. And that is part of that pollution problem, right? Because that's not going to go away anytime soon. And it's only going to get worse because the macroplastics are going to get broken down into microplastics, and that's going to take a long time. So somebody's got to work on that. Students?
So since you've been studying sharks for so long, have you found that there has been a shift in sort of like the general public view sharks or attitudes towards sharks in the time that you've been studying them?
Yeah, I would definitely say in the time that I've been studying them, but I'm not a social scientist, so I team up with those people. So I just recently teamed up with a psychologist who specializes in the study of fear, and we just published a study where we surveyed almost 600 people across a broad demographic to try to understand their perceptions of sharks. Like, what do they know about sharks? Do they fear sharks? Where do they get their information from? And she's the psychologist. I'm just the lowly shark biologist. But when she got into some of the really interesting results, one of the things she found was that if people think sharks have cognitive abilities, in other words, they can think and make decisions, it changes their perception of them. They fear them less. So what we've always known is the thing that made sharks scary was we didn't know very much about them. And as the public is learning more about sharks, and as much as I hate Shark Week, dear God, a study found is actually having a positive impact, right? It's actually starting to change people's perceptions. Now, could they change them faster if they improve their programming? Yes. But it is changing, albeit slowly, right? So I think those things, people learning more about sharks changes their fear. Way in the back.
Thanks, Dr. Lowe. This is a great presentation. Two questions. Can you please ask the white sharks to come back to Hermosa Beach? We go out there and we don't see them anymore. Secondly, can you give us your perspective, your hopes for the new UN High Seas Treaty 3030 initiatives and how it can help shark populations?
Yes. So first of all, I want the sharks to come back to Belmont Shore, please. That was awesome. Yeah, we drive to Santa Barbara 2 or 3 times a week, or San Diego. They're here. It was so great. Okay, the high seas fishery is it's a blank slate. Nobody really knows what's happening out there. We know that adult white sharks are out there, and it's basically, remember, that's international waters, right? Nobody really controls that. There are treaties about supposedly what's caught out there, where it's landed, but other than that, there's no way to control it. So right now, what a bunch of nations are trying to do is work together for fisheries that fish there to try to tighten up some of the practices that are occurring. Get better data so we can tell if populations are getting in trouble before they're really hurting. So our biggest problem is we don't have good data from that fishery. And then the other challenge is those boats move and they land in different places, which makes tracking things very difficult. Shark fins are a challenge because a lot of sharks are caught, some sharks are caught in those fisheries, and nobody knows where they're from. And they're hard to track. And of course, when you're only bringing parts back, it makes it even more difficult. So there's a lot of work being done, a lot of negotiating being done because it is an unregulated part of the ocean.
As climate change worsens and the sea elevation levels change, leading to temperature changes, how adapted are these species of shark in their migratory routes? Because during their mating seasons, they have a specific route. So eventually, would there be a point where it's like a boiling point where they conflict with other species, or would other temperature changes be too sudden for them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. What a lot of scientists are looking at right now is those movements, because that'll tell us a lot, because we know what ocean temperatures are doing, and we can maybe make predictions on where sharks are going to go based on water temperature. Your question about can they adapt is the big question, right? Because the ocean is warming faster than we even predicted, and that means the rate at which they can evolve may be affected, right? So you could get sharks moved to different places because they're seeking out adequate conditions. And when they get moved there, what if there is insufficient food? What are they going to do then? The advantage that sharks have always had is their mobility, their ability to move from a place that was uninhabitable to a place that's more habitable. And what happens with global climate change is that as those coastal waters get warmer, their ability to find those places that are more habitable is going to become more challenging. And the question is, will there be sufficient food resources for them there? Physiologically, there's a whole different thing. So a lot of researchers right now are looking at what is the upper temperature tolerance for some species. So the other part that I like to remind people is that most sharks are ectotherms. Their bodies are the same temperature as the water. When the water's cold, their metabolism's low. When the water warms up, their metabolism warms up. As the oceans continue to warm, their basal metabolism, their standard metabolism, will rise, which means they're going to have to eat more. So where's that food going to come from? Everybody's going to have to eat more. So this is another challenge of global climate change that we just don't understand. We have a little bit of data. I have students doing some really cool math trying to make predictions on how much more they'll have to eat as water temperatures rise and their metabolisms go up. Can we predict? So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. That's where a lot of science is being focused.
When it comes to these moribund sharks being swept on shore with severe brain damage, what's the stance of marine biologists? Do they prefer to give them a coup de grace, mercy killing, or do they prefer to let nature take its course and leave them there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a lot of times now, knowing what we know, what most of us would do would be euthanize those animals. Because the assumption is at that point, those animals are probably going to die based on what we think are these infections. The times where we're always cautious is when we find fishing gear in them. Because a lot of times some of the animals are exhausted from being caught and they broke off the line and they come to the beach. And maybe with a little extra help, it's possible that they could recover from that. So there are times when my crew have been out and we've had that situation where if I see signs of fishing-related trauma, like fresh fishing-related trauma, that we may actually try to revive them. But other than that, I would say they probably won't make it.
Do sharks communicate within the species, or do they also communicate between species of sharks at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do believe they communicate, and they probably use a variety of methods to do that. Some of it's body language, some of it's chemical. So my guess is there's some species, in other words, they can interspecies communicate with each other. Obviously that has to happen, so mating can occur and all those good things. But interspecies communication we know also occurs. So for example, sharks exhibit body language. Everybody knows what happens when you scare a cat. It arches its back, it raises its fur, right? That's called an agonistic display. And that's a warning. You don't have to be a cat to understand that cat's pissed off, right? And if you back off, that behavior subsides. So my predecessor, Don Nelson, was the first to figure out that sharks exhibit an agonistic display. They drop their pectoral fins, they arch their back, they go into this exaggerated swimming behavior, and that's akin to that cat arching its back. If you back off, the shark's behavior subsides. So sharks exhibit a body language that even we can interpret now, but many other animals can also interpret. So there's been video of sharks displaying to other species of sharks, and they know that that shark is pissed off based on a universal body language. That's a great question.
Do you ever see, like, individual sharks will hang out near other individual sharks more often than other sharks?
You mean for white sharks?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we don't understand yet is whether there are shark gangs, right? So we do have a lot of the sharks tagged at these aggregation sites, and we do have the ability to see who's being detected by what receiver when. And we do an analysis called network analysis, which was developed from social media, right? So we can ask who is hanging out with who. And what we find is that there's some loose associations with individuals that may use this aggregation site and then move somewhere and then show up at the same aggregation site about the same time. Whether they're actually moving together, we don't really know. The one thing we do know from hours and hours and hours of drone footage is they are not like buddies. They don't like to be right next to each other. In fact, they hate that. So when they get close to each other, that's when you start to see individuals start getting a little aggressive. So it's weird. They like to be in the same area, but they don't like to be right next to each other. It's almost like there's safety in numbers, but we haven't really seen signs of, hey, you're my pal, let's go to Del Mar and hang out. You had a question?
Yes. So yeah, I have two questions. So first one, for juveniles, when they're on the coast of California, what age do they usually, when they're not considered juvenile, they move away from the coast?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something we've been trying to figure out. We know that they show up as babies. We get, some of the smallest are maybe 4 feet long. And then we think they grow about a foot a year for their first probably 7 or 8 years. And then that growth starts to slow. Males grow faster than females initially, but females get bigger than males. So males probably mature at around 10 or 11 feet. Females don't mature until probably at minimum 12, maybe even 14 feet. And anywhere between, females mature probably between 12 and maybe 16 or 17 years old. So we see sharks along Southern California coast at these aggregation sites that are maybe 9 feet long. And then after that, occasionally, every once in a while, we might see a 10-footer, but they become rare. So it's actually the teenagers that we know the least about. We don't know where they go. They don't seem to aggregate. They definitely don't go to the adult aggregation sites. It's kind of dangerous for them there because there are bigger ones there. So that's a mystery. Nobody really knows where the teenagers hang out.
Okay. And then the second question, do you kind of pay attention, or have you really known about the population of the sharks going back to, say, South Africa, Confi, when the orcas took them out, pretty much?
Yeah, I talked to my friend yesterday, and she said no, they're not back yet. They had another white shark a couple weeks ago come up. Really? That was an orca predation. But a lot of the sharks in Mosel Bay have not come back.
Oh, that's sad.
They don't think they all got killed. They think they just moved.
Yeah, a lot of them moved away, sure.
Yeah. Jeff.
Chris, I'm wondering, do you have any population numbers on blue sharks? It seems like a lot of the pelagics are coming back, but blue sharks responded the same way?
Yeah, so I left that out. I looked at that stock assessment, and actually the stock assessment for blue sharks for the Northeast Pacific, because again, it's considered one population, is positive. Now, for those of us in California, we used to see lots of blue sharks, right? And the question is, where have they gone? According to NOAA and some of the tagging data, they think there's been a shift. So they're no longer using Southern California as much as a nursery. Now, nobody knows where the nursery is anymore, but the numbers based on fishery data suggest that the population is about the same. So it doesn't look like the population's crashed. It just looks like things have moved. And that could be a climate change driven phenomenon.